Ready for Chapter 4 of the Skylark song? Robin didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to do. Remember the training, she thought as she grabbed the side of Wade's chair, feet skidding out from under her as the glider tilted at an alarming angle. What first? Safe gliding altitude. Do that first. Safe? Ha! Robin scoffed to herself, even as she reached around Wade's slumped torso and yanked the yoke back hard, pulling the nose of the aircraft level with the horizon. A draft caught the tail and shook the glider like an unexpected wave on the ocean. Jamming at the pedals with her hands as she scrambled over Wade's lap, she got the flaps on the wings opened enough to catch it, propelling them up in a dizzying vertical ascent. That should buy her some time, and, if she was lucky, hide her from the Coyote long enough for her to, First aid, she scolded herself firmly. Step 1, check for signs of... She squirmed around in the cramped space, yanking off her right glove with her teeth and setting her fingers against Wade's neck. There was a pulse, but it was thready and stuttered. Step 2, stop the bleeding, she said. Medical kit is, rutting. Hells! The spot where it was usually secured on the slim shelving built into the ribs of the glider was empty, the straps torn and frayed. It must have gone out the side of the glider when Robin did. Improvise, Sergeant, she scolded herself when the wash of despair threatened to rob her of motivation. Oiled canvas patches weren't designed to be absorbent. In fact, they were pre-pasted to be almost the exact opposite, ready to slap on a tear. Not a person. Still, they would have to do. Yanking her scarf from around her neck and keeping her ears open for the buzz of an aeroship, Robin scuffled around the cabin, the floor juddering and shuddering beneath her feet as the glider drifted rudderless. She scooped up 2 patches that hadn't been sucked into the sky and, working quickly, folded her scarf into a pad big enough to cover a bullet wound. Then she jammed it down hard on Wade's shoulder, making sure it really got in there. She didn't have time to be disgusted by the way she could see right through to the bone, or by the smell of the raw meat and blood of him. The medics would worry about how clean the scarf was and the possibility of putrid wounds after she got their asses back to Saskwya and down on the ground. Wiping the blood from the edges of the wound with the tail of her shirt, Robin slapped the 2 patches over her scarf, using their hastily applied adhesive to hold it in place. Wade grunted, head rolling, eyes open long enough for her to see just the whites. I'm sorry, Wade. I'm so sorry, she said. And then she unclipped him from his seat and heaved him around the back of it to hers. He made a rough groan scream sort of sound, but didn't wake up. Robin was no medic, but she didn't think that was good. Her hands were shaking too badly to get him clipped in right, so she just slung the safety belts around him, tucking his ruined arm in close to his chest, and tied him into place. Then she threw herself down into the pilot's seat. Home, she thought desperately. Just get us home. You can do it, Sergeant. You can. Just don't panic. Deep breaths. If it was there at all, the buzz of the Coyote's aeroship was lost in the whistle of wind against canvas. She couldn't hear him, but neither had they heard him on his first approach either. He wouldn't have given up. Don't get complacent, Robin warned herself. Go. Get away. Slowly, tentatively, Robin raised her arms. It felt like she was pushing through thick sand and not just air. Her arms shook, hells, her whole body shook with the intense, screaming desire to run away, run away, run away. Robin forced each finger to curl around the steering column, the nubs biting into her bare hands. Faster, faster, her mind screamed, but her body wouldn't comply. The world was quiet, slow, almost calm. 1 foot here, 1 foot there, she said, placing them with deliberate care on the pedals. The crackle of paper drew her gaze downward to the topographic map pinned to the floor with thumbtacks. A pair of red circles marked the target, and home was that way, Robin said. She jammed the yoke to the side and shouldered into the turn. The glider swooped and dove, careening to the right, cutting through the cloud cover in a steep bank that left her stomach far behind. She didn't dare get too close to the tree line, not without knowing where the Coyote was now, and not without the guarantee of an updraft to propel them back high enough to keep them on the front lines. Wade would always rise in gentle circles on a breeze if he was able. Robin had no time for a slow ascent, hopping from gust to gust, watching the birds and leaves for signs of an upswell, like a small boat on a choppy lake. She was concentrating so fiercely on staying aloft that the rip of a bullet through the wooden floor behind her made her scream. Wood splinters flew, and she was glad she had her goggles on still as they pinged off the windscreen and into her face. She pushed hard, slamming the glider in another direction, ducking and weaving. The coyote was directly below her. He had to be. She couldn't see him. Get behind his tail, she thought, reminded of the dogs she'd evaded in the factory fields. He can't shoot you if you're not upwind of him. His guns are under his cockpit and on his nose. Another hard jerk, and she was diving again, belly skimming the treetops, head craned up to catch the shadow of his aeroship against the sunset. Gliders were, by nature, slower than the Klonn aeroships, so he should pass over her in... there! A flock of small brown birds burst out of the canopy in front of her, and she followed them up, rising behind the coyote, and just too high for his belly gun to hit without first slicing through his own wings. She offered a sneer of her own at the tailpipes. The aeroplane swerved and looped. The silver helmet in the cockpit craned around to glare at Robin. She watched his hands reflected through his own windscreen and copied the motion, staying on his tail, using the heat from his exhaust to keep her aloft. Dipping, diving, careening in tight circles, the glider's greater maneuverability and lightness of frame kept the dancing close. The yoke fought her hard, her mid-flight gained muscles just barely strong enough to keep it on her leash. Her palms burned, and a jagged tear opened on the underside of her thumb. But the longer Robin rode the controls, the more the intuition, the feel of the air around her began to coalesce. She could work with it, instead of against the natural dip and sway. Just like she'd guessed what Wade would do next, she began to anticipate the coyote's moves, and then, then the clever, stubborn, horrible bastard ran out of gas. His machine started to whine and sputter, coughing puffs of black smoke into the air. The sky was dark, the skinny moon and glittering stars reflecting like mercury off the aeroship's hull. It was enough for Robin to see by, though, and she watched as the coyote turned tail and ran. Evening had cooled the forest, and the mist rising from the trees obscured his flight path, but Robin dabbed a fingerprint of blood on the map to indicate where he'd disappeared. Fear and adrenaline washed away, and relief dropped like an icy stone in Robin's gut. Exhausted, aching, bleeding, and praying that her fancy flying hadn't taken so long that Wade was past the point of help, Robin wrenched the glider north. They hit the hard-packed dirt of the runway with a juddering jerk. Robin barely had enough presence of mind to remember to yank the handbrake sharply. The glider stopped just short of its nose crumpling against the side of a hangar. Her hands, already blistered severely, protested sharply, splitting open and dripping blood onto her thighs when she finally prized her rigid fingers from the yoke. Before the glider had even settled, someone from the ground crew had untied the door flaps, reaching in. The crewman paused, staring in horror at the interior of the glider. The few remaining pieces of Robin's tools were strewn across the floor, still skittering as the craft settled into place. The canvas on the other side of the body was entirely absent. Wade was slumped in Robin's seat, sticky, ominous red puddled on the floor by his limply curled fingers, running into his palm from beneath his shirt cuff like a benediction. "The captain's hurt!" Robin snarled from the front seat, and that was enough to startle the crewman into action. He called for a medical porter, and then hopped into the glider to detangle Wade's limp body from Robin's hasty spiderweb of crisscrossing safety straps. The crewman had to saw through the leather straps with his boot knife. Robin unclipped herself from the pilot's seat and tried not to stare at the streaks of blood her own touch left behind on the buckle. Porters surged into the small interior, pushing Robin back when she tried to help them, barking at her to stay out of the way as they got Wade slumped out the door and loaded onto a stretcher. Once they had, another medic yanked her from the glider and shoved her up against its side, preventing her from following after the group who'd huddled around her pilot. The medic examined her hands, but Robin's eyes were for Wade only. Two solidly built porters knelt at the foot and head of the two-white stretcher and hefted the whole thing onto their shoulders. Wade's head lolled to the side, his lips bloodless. Robin's heart slammed against the hollow of her throat. A third medic was already beside them, cutting off Wade's uniform jacket, pulling at the sticky glue on the canvas patches, revealing the injury that Robin had spent the whole flight back trying not to think about. There wasn't much of his shoulder left. She wasn't sure the medics would even be able to save his arm. He would definitely never be able to fly a glider again. Then Wade was whisked away. Robin shoved aside the medic, fussing over her hands, and followed in Wade's wake like a tattered kite. The medic clicked his tongue in annoyance and rushed after her. They were forcefully separated again in the medical center's hallway. Wade was rushed towards the surgery theater. She was chivied into a private room. Up on the edge of the bed, Sergeant. Sit and don't move. Hands out, the medic ordered. Robin obeyed. The medic shoved gauze into her palms and doused it with the yellow sting of iodine. Robin winced, but didn't let go. Do not move, the medic repeated, wagging a finger in her face. Then he rushed out with a clipboard and a harried gait, to no doubt report in on Robin's health to some scrubbed-up Bene desk pilot. It was only then that Robin realized how dark it seemed in the room. Though the gas lamps were apparently lit, going by the smell, she could hardly see anything past the bridge of her nose. Oh, she was still wearing her goggles. Robin reached up with one hand and tried to undo the large buckle at the back of the wide strap, but her palms hurt too much. Using her knuckles, she shoved at the rim of the goggles until they rode up on her forehead. She was sure she looked a fright, blood streaking her cheek, hair shoved into bizarre tufts, braid loosened from her impromptu stroll along the glider's wing, but she didn't care. She returned her hand to the iodine-soaked gauze and told herself that the renewed sting was punishment for disobeying. How can I pray now? She thought suddenly. When the gods will be able to see the state of my hands, will they mistake me for a Bene? Will they listen? The medic returned before Robin could think any further down that path, and she was grateful for the distraction. He looked serious and was trailing an administration officer in his wake. The woman was clearly freshly commissioned. Her uniform was too clean, her expression too eager, too serious. She had a tight black bun, her dark brown skin scrubbed clean, and had a probing, eager gaze. Her uniform buttons still had held their factory shine. The medic removed the gauze from Robin's hands and began the careful process of cleaning and wrapping them. Robin ignored him and turned her attention to the officer. How's Captain Perwink? She asked. He'll live, the officer replied, and Robin slumped with heart-thumping relief. He'll live. He'll probably find a pretty rich wife after this and be done with the air patrol altogether, but I did it. I saved him, Robin thought. Handsome Bene men didn't need to find jobs after they got an honorable discharge. Their pension and the esteem bestowed upon them was usually enough to provide them with a comfortable existence among their fellow civilians. I'm not here to discuss Perwink, the officer said, tone abrupt. Give me your report, Sergeant. Robin was startled by the terseness, but she supposed the air patrol must be pretty desperate to know why one of their best officers was lying in the infirmary, half bled dry and shoulder a wreck. The flight was normal and on schedule, as per our orders, until we neared the drop point, Robin said, forcing her tone to be neutral, her face to betray none of the pain she felt from her hands or from the residual shock of the mid-air dance. Just as we were about to release the... She cut her eyes to the medic. Package, the officer supplied, not looking up from the careful notes she was taking. Her clipboard was also factory fresh. The package, Robin repeated. We were about to release the package, and then we were suddenly fired upon. The officer didn't look up. You didn't hear the other aircraft approach? For all her newness in her position, it was clear why she'd been promoted. She was serious, direct, and her tone betrayed absolutely no emotion. A chill went up Robin's spine as she shook her shoulders to dispel the urge to ward against ill luck with crossed fingers. No, we didn't hear it, ma'am, Robin replied. So it wasn't a Klonn aircraft. I didn't say that. Then you did hear it approach. I didn't, Robin insisted. She looked to the medic for confirmation that she'd already answered this question, but he was focused on her hands and his job, professionally deaf. And neither did Wade, Captain Perwink, ma'am. Neither of us heard it, as far as I knew. There was just gunfire. I assume it came up from below us, possibly took off as it watched us go overhead. Very well, the officer allowed, tone carefully blank and carefully unconvinced, if you're certain. I know what it sounds like, ma'am, Robin harumphed, slumping her shoulders, but we didn't hear him approach. It was possible that they had missed the faint sounds of the engines coming closer while they'd been talking, but more likely it was because the aeroship had been too far below or above them. At that distance, it was hard to hear anything over the soft rush of a glider cutting through the upper atmosphere. The officer looked up at the medic, then jerked her chin at the door. He finished tying off the bandages, wiped his hands on a towel, and left with his trolley cart of supplies without saying a word. Robin watched him go, feeling strangely like a baby bird left to the mercy of a vicious street cat. Oh, gods, did she know that Robin was holding back? That she hadn't spoken about her walk along the wing? Or how she'd met the other pilot's gray, cold eyes through the windscreen? Or that she wasn't ready to share the uncanny experience that had shaken her to the core? She shook her shoulders again and squared them, ready to meet the officer blow for blow if she had to. The woman was full of the sort of high-minded bene superiority that drove her crazy. And then, the officer prompted, and Robin watched as one perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose above the edge of a clipboard. And then we fought, Robin said. Captain Perwink had the situation under control, and I made repairs due to bullet holes. Once that was complete, I readied to drop the package, and did so at Captain Perwink's instruction. Were you on target? Captain Perwink said that we were in position, and told me to release the package. But were you on target? The officer insisted. As per our orders, I have no way of knowing, ma'am, Robin admitted, gritting her teeth together and forcing a bland smile to hide her irritation. How dare they deny Robin the means to know, to help, and then grill her like this? Even if we were, the other pilot shot it out of the air before it got too low. It exploded far above the tree line. The effects smoldered out in the sky. Did any of it meet the target? No, ma'am. Not that I could see. The officer took time to make notes, head bobbing to herself. Robin had no idea what that meant. The scratch of the pen on the paper grated on her nerves, but she remained at parade rest to keep from fidgeting, or as close to parade rest as possible while sitting on a cot. But did you know there was a topographic map? The officer asked at length. I found it spread out on the floor by the tail pedals when I took his seat. The officer made a noise low in her throat, and Robin couldn't tell if it was meant to be encouraging or not. It sure didn't sound like it. And have you had much flight training, Sergeant? Just the standard emergency preparedness courses, ma'am, Robin admitted, getting antsy. I don't have the money, she thought uncharitably, but said, time to do anything more than the basics. And how did you find flying the glider, Sergeant? Was it difficult? Robin frowned, uncertain as to why anyone would care. No, she said, and then amended, well, no more difficult than I thought it would be. It was a bit harder to wrestle the stick around with a dead weight in the cabin, but I watch the captain when he flies. I'm pretty familiar with the dash. Did the captain ever allow you to fly when you were on any other flights? What? Robin asked, startled. No, of course not. That would have been completely irresponsible. Look, I'm sorry, Officer Vendor. Officer Vendor, but I'm very confused by this line of questioning, ma'am. Wade has never done anything that would require a formal reprimand while in the air, and neither have I. I told you. We were shot at. I only flew the glider because Wade was unconscious. What is this really about? Officer Vendor finally lifted her gaze, but the look she sent Robin was cold and closed, impossible to interpret. What is this really about? Robin asked again. Our scouts in the air said that there was some spectacular flying going on, and when the general realized that it was you flying on the way home... Vender's expression softened, something akin to pride flickering in her gaze. Robin shook her head, even more confused. I'm sorry, are you saying that they were happy to hear that it had been me dancing with the Coyote? Captain Purwink is off the roster. Permanently, Officer Vender said, her face shutting down again, her tone clipped and impersonal once more, the very picture of Benet restraint. We have a spare glider, and nobody with the in-flight hours or experience to fly it. The next pilot in line for promotion is, well, unfit. She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. They're young. Far too young. Robin felt realization strike like lightning. Surely you're not suggesting that I... She trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. I am not suggesting anything, Vender said, but she said it with a note of whimsy. She was lying. On purpose. Omens, Robin said, slouching into the cot. Get yourself in order, Sergeant, and report to the General's office as soon as you're able. Officer Vender nodded curtly and tucked her clipboard under one arm. She offered Robin a smile so genuine and confident that it knocked the breath out of her, as solidly as any punch to her stomach might have. Officer Vender then turned to exit the room. Just before she left, she paused in the doorway and looked back over her shoulder. Congratulations, Captain Arianhod. Show those boys how we girls give the enemy hell. And then she was gone. Robin was alone, dizzy and confused. Her heart fluttered against her ribs, her pulse beating in the hollow of her throat with such a speed that, for a moment, Robin wondered if she would be sick. She reached up and pinched her own cheek hard. It hurt. She assumed that meant she was awake. There's no way they're serious, she thought. Captain Arianhod? She brushed her shoulder with crossed fingers just to be safe. Mid-flight to pilot in one night, an encounter with... Oh, omens, she cursed, and pushed off the bed and ran down the hall after Vender. Officer! She cried when she caught up to the other woman, who was just turning to go into one of the long string of offices. Vender paused and turned, her stern mask back in place, and a frown playing at the sides of her mouth. Arianhod, she replied, clearly not willing to spread the news of Robin's new title before it had been made official. Was there anything you wanted to add? Yes, Robin said. The aircraft we danced with, the pilot. It was the Coyote. Underneath her grave expression, Officer Vender turned clammy pale. Are you sure? Robin nodded. I saw the tailpipes, ma'am. Clearly. For a long second, Vender seemed to have completely lost the ability to speak. Her mouth worked and she inhaled, but no sound came out. Finally, right as Robin was starting to wonder if she would have to pound her superior officer on the back to get her to stop turning blue, Vender coughed and sucked in a lung full of air. She patted Robin's arms once as if laying down a blessing and then said, Very well. I will make certain that gets into the report. See you next time.
Give up when you're down.